the ship's intercom crackled to life, punctuated by the sing-song tone of a Relathian captain trying, futilely, to sound casual. "Ah, esteemed Terran ambassador, welcome aboard the Nova Parody. We're, delighted to have you among us. Truly, an honor." Kale rested a hand on her hip, her weathered face betraying both amusement and skepticism. "Right," she muttered under her breath, glancing at her translator unit. The captain's intonation was painfully obvious even across species, pure, unfiltered discomfort. Behind her, Drell, the towering alien Deathworlder who'd reluctantly accepted her as his liaison, rumbled a deep laugh. His leathery skin shimmered faintly under the artificial lights, a reminder of the thick, protective hide he'd developed on his homeworld, Zelkor. "Humans make them nervous," Drell mused, his predatory grin exposing rows of sharp teeth. "They think you're fragile." Kale raised an eyebrow. "Fragile? Coming from someone who flinched at the word shark yesterday?" Drell bristled, his thick tail thumping against the deck. "You described it as a predator that doesn't stop moving, ever. That's unnatural." "It's just a fish," Kale countered, a sly grin tugging at the corners of her lips. "A fish with teeth and a healthy appetite for, well, anything smaller than it. Anyway, you're calling me fragile?" Their banter was interrupted by the subtle hiss of the door's opening. Captain Illyra entered, flanked by two other Relathians. Their translucent skin glimmered faintly as if the light passed through them. They had an almost gelatinous appearance, but Kale knew better than to underestimate them. Relathians were known for their intellect, not their physical prowess. "Ambassador Kale," Illyra began, their voice tinged with forced diplomacy, "it is an honor to host a human on this joint expedition. Truly, we hope our cultures can learn from each other." Drell leaned in close, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear, translation, "They think you're a liability, and they're waiting for you to prove it." Kale shot him a warning glance. "Don't start." Then, turning to the captain, she smiled brightly. "The honor's all mine, Captain. I look forward to proving that humans aren't quite as soft as you might think." Illyra shifted uncomfortably, their gelatinous body rippling faintly. "Of course, Ambassador. Now, if you'll both join us in the briefing room, we can discuss our mission in more detail." The briefing room was modest, but Kale's attention was immediately drawn to the holographic display at its center. A massive, swirling gas giant dominated the projection, its vibrant colors shifting mesmerizingly. Orbiting it was a smaller, rocky planet, dark, uninviting, and shrouded in mystery. "This," Illyra announced, "is Harsk 7. It is designated as a Level 9 hostile environment, and its surface has remained unexplored. Our objective is to establish preliminary ground surveys and assess potential resource viability." Drell snorted. "Level 9? You brought humans to a Level 9 world?" Kale shot him a sidelong glance. "You realize you're talking about me like I'm not here, right?" The captain continued, ignoring the interruption. "The surface is riddled with dangerous fauna, volatile weather systems, and peculiar anomalies that our initial probes couldn't identify. That is why we've formed a coalition team. Ambassador Kale, your expertise in adaptive problem-solving may prove invaluable." Translation, Drell whispered again, "If anyone's getting eaten, it's you." Kale sighed. "Not helping." As the briefing concluded, Kale felt the weight of the mission settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about representing humanity, it was about proving humanity's worth among species that measured strength in carapaces, hides, and brute force. And she'd do it, even if she had to drag Drell's overconfident self along for the ride. Later, as they prepped for the descent to Harsk 7's surface, Kale found herself staring at the equipment rack. Drell approached, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Do you have any idea what you're walking into?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Kale chuckled softly. "Nope. That's what makes it fun." Drell growled. "You're reckless. And you're scared of a fish," she shot back, slinging her pack over her shoulder. The drop pod rumbled as they strapped in, its interior tight and claustrophobic. Kale glanced over at Drell, who was noticeably calm. She envied his composure, though she'd never admit it. The pod shuddered violently as it entered the planet's atmosphere, flames licking at the viewport. Kale's pulse quickened. "This ride's bumpier than advertised," she quipped, gripping her harness tightly. "Get used to it," Drell muttered. "This is the easy part." When the pod finally slammed into the surface, the hatch burst open, revealing a landscape that could only be described as alien chaos. Jagged black rocks jutted from the ground like teeth, and the air shimmered with a strange, almost oily haze. The sound of distant, guttural howls echoed across the desolate plain. Kale stepped out first, her boots crunching against the coarse ground. "Well," she said, "it's no beach vacation, but I've seen worse." Drell followed, his gaze scanning the horizon. "Stay close. If anything decides to eat you, I'd prefer not to explain it to the captain." Kale smirked. "Don't worry. If I get eaten, I'll make sure it's after I explain sharks to them." Drell's tail thumped against the ground again, but Kale didn't miss the hint of a smile on his face. As they moved further from the pod, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional distant screech. "This place is alive," Drell muttered, his tone grim. "Good," Kale replied, her eyes scanning the terrain. "That means it can die if it tries anything stupid." Drell stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Wait." Kale froze, following his gaze to a nearby ridge. Something moved, just a flicker of motion against the black rocks. "What is it?" she whispered. Drell's eyes narrowed. "Not sure. But it's watching us." Kale's fingers tightened around the grip of her sidearm. "Think it knows what a shark is?" Drell let out a low growl. "If it doesn't, it's about to find out." The winds of Harsk 7 tore through the desolate landscape, carrying an unholy screech that Kale was certain no living creature should make. She squinted into the horizon, the oily haze distorting the jagged terrain like a half-forgotten nightmare. Behind her, Drell scanned the area with predatory precision, his eyes catching every subtle flicker of movement. "This place is worse than I thought," Drell muttered, his deep voice almost lost in the roar of the wind. Kale adjusted her visor, frowning as her HUD glitched. "The tech's struggling too. Sensors are picking up anomalies. Readings don't make sense." "Define don't make sense," Drell asked, his tail twitching. Kale's tone hardened. "Atmospheric composition fluctuates like a broken dial. High oxygen 1 second, toxic methane the next. No wonder the probes couldn't map this place." Drell grunted. "That's why they sent us. If we fail, they'll chalk it up to human fragility and Deathworld arrogance." Kale smirked. "Well, we can't have that, can we?" Their light banter did little to ease the gnawing tension. The planet itself seemed alive, watching, waiting, and far too eager to pounce. As they trekked further from the drop pod, Kale's unease deepened. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by their own movements. Drell stopped abruptly, raising a hand. Kale froze, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she whispered, fingers brushing the grip of her weapon. Drell pointed. A shallow gorge spread out before them, its depth shrouded in shadows. Something slithered within, its movement too fluid to belong to a land dweller. Kale caught a glimpse of segmented flesh glistening in the dim light, and her stomach churned. "It's big," Drell said simply. "How big?" Kale's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Big enough to swallow you whole and not even notice," Drell replied, his tone grim. Kale rolled her eyes. "Terrific. Let's not introduce ourselves." As they circled the gorge, Kale's HUD flickered again, the anomalies intensifying. Symbols she didn't recognize began scrolling across her visor, and her ears popped from sudden pressure shifts. She pulled up her communicator, only to find static. "Drell, you getting this?" she asked, turning to him. The towering alien frowned, his head tilted as if listening. "Something's wrong," he said. "It's too quiet." Kale raised an eyebrow. "You call this quiet?" Before Drell could respond, a guttural roar shattered the air, sending vibrations through the ground. Kale barely had time to draw her weapon before the creature from the gorge emerged. Its body was serpentine, segmented with chitinous plates that gleamed like obsidian. It moved with unnatural speed, its eyeless head swiveling toward them. "Run!" Drell bellowed, shoving Kale aside as the creature lunged. Kale hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. She scrambled to her feet, firing her sidearm. The shots glanced off the creature's armor, leaving only superficial scorch marks. Drell charged, his massive frame colliding with the beast in a clash of raw power. "Go!" he roared, grappling with the creature's thrashing body. Kale hesitated for only a moment before sprinting toward higher ground. Her mind raced, calculating options. The creature was faster, stronger, and impervious to standard weapons. But it wasn't invincible, nothing was. She just needed to figure out its weakness. Drell's roar of pain snapped her focus back to the battle. The creature had coiled around him, its segmented body constricting with bone-crushing force. Kale's heart clenched. She couldn't leave him. Gripping her weapon tightly, she scanned the creature's body. The joints between its plates seemed softer, less protected. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She activated her comm, praying the static would clear. "Drell! Hold on," she shouted, sprinting back into the fray. He didn't respond, his focus entirely on prying the creature's coils apart. Kale slid to a stop a few meters away, taking careful aim. Her hands shook, but she steadied herself, exhaling slowly. She fired a concentrated burst at the exposed joint nearest its head. The creature screeched, its body convulsing as the shot hit its mark. Drell took advantage of its distraction, wrenching free with a mighty roar. He grabbed a jagged rock and drove it into another joint, the creature's screeches rising to a deafening pitch. Kale didn't waste time. "Move," she shouted, grabbing Drell's arm and dragging him away. They sprinted together, the creature flailing behind them. "This isn't sustainable," Drell panted as they reached a temporary clearing. "That thing's going to keep coming." Kale nodded, her mind racing. "We need to outsmart it." Drell gave her a pointed look. "It's a killing machine. You don't outsmart killing machines. You kill them." Kale grinned, despite the situation. "Says the guy afraid of sharks." Drell groaned. "Not now, Kale." They didn't have long to plan. The creature's roars grew louder, closer. Kale's HUD flickered again, the strange symbols returning. This time, though, they were accompanied by a faint humming sound. "Wait," she said, holding up a hand. "Do you hear that?" Drell frowned. "What?" "The humming." She turned in a slow circle, her visor tracking the anomaly. The symbols began to coalesce, forming a pattern. "It's a signal. There's something nearby. Maybe something we can use." Drell didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. "Lead the way." The signal led them to a cluster of jagged rocks that jutted upward like a broken crown. Kale's visor pinpointed a small, concealed entrance. She crouched, peering inside. "Looks like some kind of cave," she said. "Might be a trap." "Or salvation," Drell countered. They didn't have time to debate. The creature's roar echoed again, this time unnervingly close. Kale ducked into the cave, Drell following close behind. The space was narrow, forcing Drell to hunch, but it opened up into a larger chamber. Strange, bioluminescent plants clung to the walls, casting an eerie blue light. Kale's HUD flickered once more before stabilizing. The symbols rearranged themselves into coherent text she could read. "Welcome, Terran," it said. Her breath caught. "Drell. I think someone's been here before." Drell's gaze darted around the chamber. "Who?" Kale shook her head. "I don't know, but," she trailed off, her eyes falling on a panel embedded in the wall. It was old, clearly of alien design, but functional. She approached it cautiously, her fingers hovering over the controls. Drell growled. "Kale, whatever you're thinking, don't." Kale grinned. "Too late." She pressed a button. The chamber hummed to life, the walls vibrating as hidden mechanisms activated. The panel emitted a soft glow, displaying a map of the area. It highlighted the creature's movements, and something else. A pulsing beacon far below the surface. "This is it," Kale said, her voice filled with wonder. "A control system. Whoever built this place, they left tools. Maybe even weapons." Drell's expression darkened. "Or a trap." "Only one way to find out," Kale replied, determination hardening her tone. "You wanted to kill the killing machine? Let's see if they left us a way to do it." The ground shook, and the creature's roar reverberated through the cave, louder than ever. Kale turned to Drell, her eyes blazing with resolve. "We fight smart, or we die stupid. You in?" Drell's lips curled into a feral grin. "Let's show it what humans and Deathworlders can do." The ground shuddered violently beneath Kale and Drell as the creature's roar reverberated through the cavern, making the bioluminescent plants tremble and dim. The glowing map flickered on the wall, the beacon still pulsing deep below. Kale's fingers flew over the alien control panel, searching for anything that could even the odds. "It's coming!" Drell growled, his massive frame tensed for battle. Kale didn't look up. I know. Just buy me some time." Drell snorted, gripping the jagged rock he'd used earlier. "You owe me for this." Before Kale could respond, the creature burst into the chamber, its segmented body coiling through the narrow entrance like liquid obsidian. Its eyeless head snapped in their direction, a guttural growl emanating from deep within its chest. "Any day now." Drell barked as the creature lunged. Kale's breath caught, and she slammed her fist down on a button she barely understood. The chamber's walls lit up, streaks of energy pulsing through ancient conduits. A low hum built in the air, growing louder until it was almost deafening. The creature hesitated, its head jerking toward the glowing walls. Drell took the opportunity to strike, swinging his improvised weapon with all his strength. The rock collided with one of the creature's joints, eliciting a screech of pain, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Kale frantically scanned the alien interface, her mind racing. The symbols had morphed again, forming what looked like instructions. "Localized energy pulse, coordinates locked," it read. "Coordinates locked," she muttered. "What coordinates?" Her HUD flickered, and a red dot appeared over the creature's body. Realization hit her like a freight train. "Oh, that's coordinates." "Kale!" Drell shouted, dodging a swipe from the creature's tail. The force of the blow shattered a nearby wall, sending chunks of rock flying. Kale's hands flew to the controls, heart pounding. "I hope this doesn't kill us too," she whispered, slamming the activation button. The hum in the chamber reached a crescendo, and a blinding pulse of energy erupted from the walls. The creature shrieked, its body convulsing as arcs of electricity danced across its segmented plates. The smell of burning chitin filled the air. Drell didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his powerful legs propelling him with inhuman speed. With a roar, he drove the jagged rock into one of the creature's exposed joints, twisting it with savage force. The creature let out a final, ear-splitting screech before collapsing to the ground, its body twitching. Kale stared, chest heaving. "Is it dead?" Drell yanked the makeshift weapon free and stepped back cautiously. "It's not moving." "That's good enough for me." The tension in the room didn't dissipate. The walls continued to hum, the map glowing more intensely. Kale turned back to the control panel, her fingers brushing against the screen. The beacon's pulsing had grown frantic, and new symbols scrolled across the display. "Drell," she said, her voice tight. "This isn't over." He frowned. "What now?" Kale pointed to the map. "The beacon, it's warning us about something." The creature might have just been a guard. Drell's tail lashed the air. "A guard? Against what?" Kale didn't answer. Her focus was locked on the display as it zoomed out, revealing a massive, pulsating mass deep below the surface. It dwarfed the creature they had just fought. The text on the screen translated itself in real time, primary anomaly detected. Drell leaned over her shoulder, his expression grim. That's not good. Not good is an understatement, Kale muttered. If that thing wakes up. Her sentence was cut off as the chamber rumbled violently. The beacon's pulsing grew erratic, and the walls around them began to crack. Kale grabbed her pack, slinging it over her shoulder. We need to move. Now. Drell didn't argue. The two of them bolted out of the chamber, the ground shifting beneath their feet. The creature's carcass lay twitching behind them, its death throes almost pitiful compared to the tremors shaking the entire cavern. What's the plan? Drell shouted as they ran. Kale gritted her teeth. We find the beacon. Maybe we can shut this thing down before it wakes up. Maybe? Drell growled. That's not exactly reassuring. The tremors grew stronger as they descended deeper into the cave system. Strange symbols lit up on the walls, their meaning elusive but ominous. The air grew heavier, each breath feeling like a battle against the atmosphere itself. They finally reached a massive cavern, its ceiling stretching so high it disappeared into darkness. At its center stood the beacon, a towering structure of alien metal, pulsating with an otherworldly light. Surrounding it was a pool of viscous, black liquid that rippled with unnatural movement. Kale hesitated at the edge of the cavern, her eyes locked on the beacon. That's it, she said. But what's the black stuff? Drell sniffed the air, his expression darkening. It's alive. Kale's stomach twisted. Of course it is. The liquid began to shift, forming tendrils that reached toward the beacon. Kale's HUD flared with warnings, her visor flashing red. Hostile biomass detected, it read. Drell, we need to stop it from reaching the beacon, Kale said, her voice urgent. If it integrates, it might wake up whatever's down here. Drell cracked his knuckles, his eyes narrowing. How? Kale's mind raced. She pulled out a small, spherical device from her pack, a thermal charge. We blow it up. Drell raised an eyebrow. You're carrying explosives? Kale shrugged. Always be prepared. The tendrils moved faster now, slithering up the beacon's base. Kale armed the charge, her fingers trembling slightly. She glanced at Drell. I'll plant it. Cover me. Drell nodded, stepping forward to block the advancing biomass. His claws tore into the writhing tendrils, each strike accompanied by a wet, sickening sound. The biomass recoiled but kept advancing, relentless. Kale sprinted toward the beacon, dodging the tendrils as they lashed out at her. She reached the base, her heart pounding as she secured the thermal charge. The device beeped, its timer starting to count down. Kale, hurry! Drell shouted, struggling to hold the biomass back. I'm almost done, she yelled, twisting the charge into place. The timer ticked down to 10 seconds as she turned and bolted back toward Drell. The cavern shook violently, chunks of rock falling from above. The biomass surged forward, desperate to reach the beacon. Kale and Drell sprinted for the exit, the thermal charge's timer nearing zero. The explosion was deafening. A wave of heat and light engulfed the cavern, throwing them both to the ground. Kale covered her head as debris rained down around them. When the dust settled, she looked back to see the beacon shattered, the biomass reduced to smoldering ash. Drell groaned, pushing himself to his feet. You good? Kale nodded, coughing. Yeah. You? Never better, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The ground beneath them rumbled one last time before finally falling silent. Kale let out a shaky breath, her gaze drifting to the ruins of the beacon. Let's hope that was enough. Drell snorted. If it wasn't, I'm blaming you. Kale smirked, despite the exhaustion weighing her down. Fair. They climbed out of the cavern, the oppressive weight of the planet's hostility finally lifting. For the first time since landing on Harsk 7, Kale allowed herself to relax, if only a little. Whatever they had stopped, it wouldn't be waking up anytime soon. Kale's legs burned with every step as she and Drell emerged from the cavern, the harsh winds of Harsk 7 whipping at them like an invisible predator. The sky above was a roiling cauldron of dark clouds, flashing with occasional bursts of eerie green lightning. They had stopped the immediate threat, but Kale couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. "You think that was all of it?" Drell asked, his tone half hopeful, half wary. Kale didn't answer immediately. She stared back at the cavern's entrance, now partially collapsed from the explosion. The beacon was gone, the biomass incinerated, but the memory of the massive entity displayed on the map loomed large in her mind. "No," she finally said. "That thing down there, it's still alive. But I think we delayed whatever it was trying to do." Drell growled low in his throat, his claws flexing reflexively. "Delayed isn't enough. If it wakes up—" "It won't," Kale interrupted, her voice firm. "Not if we make sure it can't." "And how do you propose we do that?" Drell asked, crossing his massive arms. Kale knelt and activated her communicator. The screen flickered, static cutting in and out before stabilizing. "Command, this is Kale," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "We have a situation." The reply crackled back. "Go ahead, Ambassador." Kale's voice hardened. "We've neutralized an immediate threat, but there's a much larger one dormant below the surface. We need orbital intervention." "Orbital intervention?" Drell repeated, his tail lashing. "You're calling in an airstrike on an entire planet?" Kale met his gaze without flinching. "You saw that map. Whatever's down there isn't just a threat to us, it's a threat to anyone who comes near this place. We can't leave it to chance." Drell didn't respond immediately. His predatory eyes studied her, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Finally, he let out a long breath. "Fine. But if this goes sideways, I'm holding you responsible." Kale smirked. "That's fair." The communicator crackled again. "Ambassador, are you certain? Orbital strikes are a last resort." Kale's tone left no room for argument. "I'm certain. Target the coordinates I'm sending now. Full barrage. We'll clear the blast radius." There was a pause on the other end, then, "Understood. Strike inbound in 10 minutes. Godspeed." Kale rose to her feet, tucking the communicator away. "Let's move. We need to be far from here when the fireworks start." The two of them ran, the landscape blurring into jagged shadows and distorted shapes as the storm intensified. Kale's visor pinged with warnings, volatile atmospheric conditions, pressure spikes, and radiation bursts. Harsk 7 was doing everything in its power to keep them from leaving alive. As they climbed a ridge overlooking their drop pod, the ground trembled beneath them. Kale stumbled but caught herself on a jagged rock. Drell steadied her with one massive hand. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," Drell said, his voice tight. Kale turned back, her heart sinking. The collapsed cavern was glowing, a deep, pulsating red that spread through the surrounding terrain like veins. The entity below was stirring. "We don't have time for this," Kale muttered, panic creeping into her voice. "The strike needs to hit before it fully wakes up." Drell snarled. "And if it doesn't?" Kale didn't answer. Instead, she doubled her pace, her mind racing. The pod was just ahead, its beacon flashing weakly through the storm. If they could reach it in time, they'd have a slim chance of escaping the blast. Behind them, the ground erupted. Massive tendrils of black biomass shot into the air, writhing like grotesque serpents. They slammed into the ground, each impact shaking the earth. Kale's stomach twisted as the tendrils began to move toward them with terrifying speed. "Move faster," she shouted, adrenaline propelling her forward. The pod's hatch opened as they approached, its automated systems struggling against the harsh environment. Kale practically threw herself inside, Drell close behind. He slammed the hatch shut, his claws gouging the metal as he secured the lock. Kale scrambled to the controls, her fingers flying over the interface. Come on," she muttered, willing the pod to respond. The tendrils reached the ridge, their sheer size dwarfing the pod. One of them slammed into the ground just meters away, sending a shockwave that nearly tipped the pod over. "Kale!" Drell roared, bracing himself against the wall. I'm working on it, she snapped, her voice frantic. The pod finally roared to life, its thrusters igniting. Kale gripped the controls tightly as they lifted off, the tendrils lashing at the air around them. One struck the side of the pod, sending it into a violent spin. Stabilizers are offline. Kale shouted, struggling to regain control. Drell growled. Then stabilize it manually. Kale gritted her teeth, her hands flying over the controls. The pod's trajectory evened out just as they broke through the atmosphere. Below them, the tendrils writhed violently, reaching toward the sky as if trying to grasp them. Command, this is Kale, she said into the communicator. We're clear. Initiate the strike. The reply was immediate. Understood. Strike commencing. Kale and Drell watched from the viewport as the orbital barrage began. Blinding beams of energy pierced the atmosphere, slamming into the surface with devastating force. The explosions rippled outward, consuming everything in their path. The tendrils disintegrated, their remains turning to ash. The ground itself seemed to collapse, the entire area caving in on itself. Kale felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Harsk 7 was an unforgiving world, but it had been alive in its own way. Now, it was little more than a crater. It's done, she said softly, leaning back in her seat. Drell nodded, his expression unreadable. For now. Kale turned to him, a small smile tugging at her lips. Still think humans are fragile? Drell chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. You're still soft. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Kale laughed, the tension finally breaking. I'll take that as a compliment. As the pod drifted toward the rendezvous point, Kale allowed herself a moment to reflect. They had survived Harsk 7, but more importantly, they had faced it together. Humans and Deathworlders, two species that, against all odds, had found common ground in the face of the unknown.